Thanks everyone for hanging out with us for a few minutes. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I'm Kevin Cutter. I'm a account director with Tevora. I've been with the organization about 6 years. I'll be moderating with Justin Graham, who's our manager for our healthcare practice. And so over today's webinar, we're going to have some introductions as we're covering now, discuss the differences between E1, I1, and R2 HITRUST, discuss why E1 is growing in popularity, and also look at the common pitfalls in achieving E1 certification. And collect questions throughout, please. You can actually write those in the chat. I'll be grabbing those. And then towards the end, we'll go ahead and have a more of an informal Q&A for anyone that has thoughts they'd like for Justin to go ahead and tackle. Next slide. And so, yeah, joining us is Justin Graham, manager of our healthcare practice, information security, and compliance. Justin, go ahead and dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Welcome, everybody. To start this webinar, the focus is going to be on the E1, obviously, from the title. But here on this first slide, I do want to talk a little bit about the HITRUST organization, really to set that foundation for the entire discussion. So HITRUST is an independent organization founded in 2007. They're headquartered in Frisco, Texas. The only universally recognized healthcare information security certification. So certification is key there, and it's important to understand the distinction between an attestation and a certification, right? And the certification path is going to provide a higher level of assurance, obviously, so that's important to recognize. HITRUST is governed by a board of directors that are made up from healthcare industry leaders. And it's important to understand that one of their primary purposes is to manage and maintain the HITRUST CSF framework. So if you're going down your HITRUST certification journey, maybe you have E1 in mind, it's important to understand how this ecosystem works, right? So HITRUST owns and manages the HITRUST CSF framework. To get a HITRUST certification, you do have to subscribe to their MyCSF website. That website is used basically to facilitate the audit, right? So think of a platform where you can collaborate, you can upload evidence artifacts to, collaborate with your external assessor organization, and ultimately submit the assessment to HITRUST, and they perform a rigorous QA on each and every one of these HITRUST certification efforts. So when you're doing your planning, think about, just to know the entire costs, there will be a fee directly between you and HITRUST for the access to this MyCSF website. There's also a secondary fee, and that's for bringing in an external assessor organization. That's what Tevora is, right? We're an external assessor organization. We do the audit work. We are a little unique in that we are structured in a manner where we can do readiness, gap type work, consulting type work, and bring in a separate team to do the actual validated assessment work. So that's a little bit about the HITRUST organization. Let's move now into differences when we look at the E1, the I1, and the R2. I think right off the bat, what really stands out is just think the differences in the E1, the I1, the R2 certification options by the number of requirement statements in the scope of each one, right? So with the E1, we know that there's 44 requirements that are required. With the I1, that jumps to 182, and with the R2, on average, 361 requirements are in scope. To break it down a little bit further, let's talk about the E1 and the I1. They both end in the number 1. The 1 is for a 1-year certification. So with an E1, let's say you go through all the motions, you get your certification report. The report's going to have a date on it, and that report is only valid for 1 year. So at the end of 1 year, you have to repeat that process again. I1, very similar story. It's a 1-year certification. Although on year 2 of an I1, there's an option, it's called a rapid recertification. Think of it as more of a health check. So you don't have to perform that validated assessment against all 182 requirements on year 2. It's just a subset, roughly a third, right? So roughly 60 requirements. And with the R2, that's different. The R2 is a 2-year certification. And as you can see from the graphic, on average 361 requirements in scope. With the R2, we're testing against 3 maturity levels: policy, procedure, and implementation. And with the R2, typically if you're getting into HITRUST, standing up the policies and procedures to be able to support your in-scope requirements is a bit of a task. So one of the benefits of the E1 and the I1 is only testing just one maturity level, that implementation maturity level. So that's really important to understand. But overall, I think this one graphic really shows you the difference between all the options. You can also, it's important to understand that if you start off with an E1, that might not be where you end up. So over time, it might make sense to start with an E1 and then move up to an I1, and then maybe eventually into an R2. And what makes that step easier is that when you look at the 182 requirements of the I1, the 44 from the E1 is going to be the baseline for that. So those 44 are going to move into the I1. And then once you get an I1 certification, the 182 requirements in the I1, that's the foundation, that's the baseline for the R2 requirements, right? So you're still testing the same requirements over time, and your report out is just giving your customers, your intended report recipients, a higher level of assurance as you move up this step. So.
Justin, we actually had, if you go back, we had a question that actually I think directly applies maybe to what we have here as far as a visual on the controls. How long does it typically take to get HITRUST certified?
Oh, good question. Okay. So obviously, if you look at this graphic, you're going to see there's a huge difference in the amount of effort it takes to get through each of these. I'm going to say at a very high level, from the time that you start your HITRUST journey until you have that certification report in hand, is going to average 9 to 12 months. That's probably I1, R2 kind of time frame. The E1 you can get rapidly, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, Kevin, on another slide. But obviously, if there's only 44 requirements, you can rapidly do an assessment, a readiness assessment, to see if there are any remediation items in place, and move into doing that certification audit, which again, with only 44 requirements, you can get through very rapidly. I think, Kevin, when you think about the overall timeline, one of the most important key factors that most people do not truly understand when they're starting their HITRUST journey is that if you do have to do any remediation work, right, it's like you do an E1 readiness assessment and there's a miss, right, you have a gap. If you're going to do some remediation with HITRUST, there is a 90-day holding period. So it is a maturity framework. So any control has to be in place and operating for 90 days before you can test that in the validated assessment audit. So at a minimum, you're looking at 90 days if there's any remediation. If you go through a readiness assessment, you have everything in place, right? You can get through a validated assessment with an E1 really in a matter of weeks. So you can obtain that pretty rapidly. So yeah, good question, Kevin.
Fantastic, thank you.
All right, diving a little bit further into the E1. So this slide came from the recently released HITRUST Trust Report, and it's the assessment type chosen by 2023 new customers. And I'll be honest with you, this surprised me. So I have a pretty good feel on the HITRUST ecosystem. I knew the I1 and the E1, which are the new certification types, are starting to get more traction, but I didn't think the E1 is getting as much traction as this. 47.6% of new assessment types is going to be that E1, which is that smaller level. And then on the other side, when you look at the R2, that's only 24%. So I think this is a very interesting statistic and really points that to the market adopting E1 at a much higher rate than even I imagined originally. So going from here, why E1? Lots of reasons. Very achievable, very quickly. Kevin, I think this kind of talks to that last question. You can leverage template sets for implementation and remediation efforts with any kind of certification effort. I highly recommend going through a readiness gap assessment. I think I've mentioned that 2 or 3 times already. Here at Tevora, we make it a point. We think the readiness gap assessment is the most critical part of this engagement. We put our most senior consultants on our readiness assessments. If we get through a readiness assessment and there are gaps, maybe you need a DR plan, IR plan, right? By the nature of what we do, we have a pretty decent library of templates set up, and we can help shorten that remediation effort window down tremendously. So when you look at help, in the remediation efforts, and just the fact that the E1 is a smaller certification, right? 44 requirements, very achievable, very quickly, right? Moving on to cost resource advantages. So with the R2 is the large, and that's what the traditional HITRUST certification has been for years and years and years. It has a very high cost of entry. With the R2, you have to spend a lot of resources on standing up policies, a lot of resources standing up procedure documentation. It has a very high control count. It's dynamic in nature. It can be anywhere from 260 to, we've worked with organizations based on risk factors. They've had over 1,000 requirements in scope. So you can understand that from both cost and resourcing, R2 is really tough to achieve for smaller organizations. So with the introduction of the E1 and the I1, the E1 specifically, it has a much lower cost when you want to get into this certification effort. Another really great reason to choose an E1 is how you can layer that in with unified assessment works as an add-on. So if you're in an organization and your compliance program is working with other frameworks, SOC 2, ISO, PCI, or a few examples we have here, you can layer an E1 on top of any one of those assessment efforts, right? So if you think about, we'll just pick on SOC 2 at first. If you think about the 44 requirements in an E1, and you think about the requirement set that you're testing in your SOC 2 efforts, there's over 90% overlap. So it's real easy if you're working with a mature auditing partner like Tevora, where we can come in and do the SOC 2 engagement, just layer the E1 requirements on top of that, and we can output a SOC 2 attestation report and a HITRUST certification. And we're combining those, method, as far as our assessment methodology, we're combining interview sessions, combining evidence collection. So we're presenting you with one audit, outputting out 2 reports. So it's a great add-on to any kind of compliance assessment work that you're already doing. To move on, TPRM, third-party risk applicability. So if you find yourself answering a lot of third-party security questionnaires, you'll know that they very often ask for different kinds of third-party reports, SOC 2, PCI, ISO. This HITRUST E1 is a great artifact to have in your toolbox when you're answering these third-party questionnaires. We found firsthand that there are some questionnaires that ask for a HITRUST certification report. They don't specify E1, I1, R2. So having an E1 certification really shows a level of maturity that opens the door to have these conversations with these third parties that you're answering the questionnaires for, to help ease that process. And if there are any concerns, a HITRUST E1 certification definitely provides some value there in that overall TPRM program. And the last distinct advantage here of going with an E1 is it is threat adaptive. So it allows for changes to the framework as the threat landscape evolves, right? Just to pick on SOC 2, ISO, PCI, how often are these frameworks updated, right? They're pretty static, like every 3, 4, 5 years, maybe even more in the sake of ISO. HITRUST is constantly reevaluating. So the 44 requirements in the E1 are very relevant to the current threat landscape. And I think that provides a very strategic approach going forward in your compliance works, right? You don't want a stale framework to align with. You want a framework that is changing to the current threat landscape, and the E1 brings that to the table. Another important, very important advantage of the HITRUST, really just the HITRUST certification process and the mechanics of the E1 assessment, is the concept of inheritance. So many organizations are utilizing some form of CSP. So, I have a couple options here: AWS, GCP, Azure, right? Those are pretty common out there. When you really dive in the details of doing the validation work, how do you validate the physical security that AWS is providing for their data centers, GCP, Azure, right? So HITRUST has this concept of inheritance. And you can see from the graphic here, the average number of external inheritance requests in a validated assessment last year for an E1 is 13. So you can do the quick math. I don't know if you're already doing that, but if you take the 44 requirements in the E1 and you subtract out that 13, that leaves you with 31 requirements to implement. These are requirements that are the service provider's responsibility. I think physical security is a great example, but when you look at the mechanics of how this works, these cloud CSPs, they all have a HITRUST certification. So when you're going to test a requirement that is their responsibility, you're literally just at the click of a button pulling in the scoring from their HITRUST efforts, right? So it's very quick, very easy. There is each cloud service provider offers an inheritance matrix. So they outline which controls you can inherit, at what level you can inherit, right? Are these fully inheritable, partially inheritable? Is there a dual responsibility? These matrix documents help define that. And it's important to understand that the external CSP has to approve all these. So when I'm working on my E1 assessment and I want to inherit a control, let's say from GCP, I put that request, somebody at Google actually has to approve that. So that is unique. So it's not just a blanket, you can just use this inheritance blindly. You have to have a solid rationale. You have to identify where there's a shared responsibility. Is it the cloud CSP's full responsibility? Is it my responsibility? We help you understand that in our efforts, because it can be confusing to understand where that line is. Is it 50-50? Maybe you have multiple systems involved, multiple environments, that kind of throws it off, and we kind of help guide our HITRUST clients through that process. And again, this whole inheritance concept, it's all facilitated through the MyCSF website. So we already talked about the MyCSF website. It is a required, to facilitate these audits. And I think inheritance is a great example of this, right? You have to have access to the MyCSF website to be able to utilize these inheritance requests. Ultimately, the MyCSF website is how these assessments get submitted to HITRUST. HITRUST is unique that they do look at each and every one of the certification assessments, and they do a rigorous QA on each and every one of the submissions, so you can't cheat. That kind of leads in greatly into common pitfalls. This is just what we've seen from our experience, working with E1 customers. So use an experienced HITRUST CSF assessor. I'll say that's number one. When going back just a step, when we were talking about, HITRUST is unique because they do QA work on each and every submission that comes across their desk. It is a rigorous process. And if you're partnered with an external assessor organization who does not take quality seriously, HITRUST can reject that assessment and you have to start all over. And that's happened before, right? So some of our customers come to us, they're frustrated, right? And rightfully so. But definitely partner up with an experienced HITRUST CSF assessor. There's over 100 out there. They're not all created equally, I will say that. Being an original assessor firm is an advantage for Tevora. Having a dedicated HITRUST team is an advantage for Tevora. I think having a long, strong relationship with HITRUST is a distinct advantage for Tevora. So we have a lot of great relationships with a lot of individuals over there. Moving on, minimum domain scores, super important. When you look at the CSF framework itself, it is broken down into 19 domains. Each and every one of these 19 domains are going to be common information security topics that we all know. Access control, right? Network protection, endpoint protection, right? These are just topics, and there's 19 domains, and certification is achieved at the domain level. So each one of these 19 domains has to meet a minimum score for your system to get certified. That score is 83. And where this turns into a pitfall is that you have to know that if you're looking at the E1 and there's 44 requirements sprinkled out between 19 domains, there's going to be 8 domains that only have 1 requirement. And for these 8 domains, in order to reach that minimum score, you have to nail it. You have to score 100, right? If you score 75, you're below 83. So, this ties back to you have to make sure that you do some kind of readiness assessment for the E1 certification. At a minimum, have an experienced assessor look at these 8 domains, right? These are must-haves. You have to nail these 8 controls. If you don't, you don't get certified. So that whole concept of domain scores, knowing which of these 8 domains only have 1 requirement, being able to understand how the evaluative elements relate to the illustrative procedure for implementation, how to score these, is very complicated, and you need to partner with an external assessor organization to help you navigate that.
Justin, probably another good question that just came up that may be relevant. Which topics within the HITRUST framework typically give organizations the most trouble?
Okay. I would break that down into organization size, right? So for smaller organizations, starting there, I find that smaller organizations typically struggle with change management requirements as well as third-party risk requirements, right? Sometimes for a smaller organization, maybe you only have 10 employees, right? Change management is very difficult, right? Formally approving changes when there may only be 1 or 2 people, right, that really have their hands in that pot and implementing changes. And third-party risk management, performing security assessments, that's difficult for smaller organizations. Then kind of moving up from that, I would say when you look at larger organizations, maybe a common area where we see organizations struggle would be around configuration management and performing assessments against your equipment to make sure that your OS, let's say it's just mapping back to your benchmarks, right? That's difficult to achieve in a large enterprise when you have so many systems. So I think those are 2 distinct areas, small, large, where I see organizations struggle implementing these controls.
Thank you.
Yeah. Moving on. Common pitfall, identify scope clearly and early. So with HITRUST certifies systems. They do not certify organizations. So you have to define the scope of your system very clearly. And it's very helpful to partner with an external assessor organization to help you document and define that scope. You don't want to be in a situation where you're doing some readiness work and you think you have an idea of what the scope is, but then it changes midway through. And then when you go to test that, maybe you didn't put the emphasis on that in the readiness work as you originally thought. So if you're just starting down your HITRUST journey, E1's on your radar, work with an external assessor organization to nail down your scope. Do it early and very clearly. Scope creep, misidentification of scope is something that we can see take these assessments sideways pretty quickly. And finally, assign requirement owners and an assessment lead. You need a quarterback on your side, right? You need somebody to help manage the relationship with your external assessor organizations. We're somewhat unique in that we have a dedicated PMO office, and we provide project management services with all of our engagements. You get a dedicated project manager, super helpful. But as you get through these with any kind of audit work, really, have somebody who's leading that, right? They're responsible for getting evidence requests sent out to where they need to go in the organization. They're responsible for coordinating any questions back and forth. And with that, also assign requirement owners, right? So as that quarterback, as that assessment lead, you need to know for the E1 of these all 44 requirements, who owns this, right? Who can provide me screenshots to show implementation of this particular control? Who can generate reports, right? Who designed this control? That's very important to identify early on. So assign requirement owners and an assessment lead there. Kevin, I think that's pretty much it for common pitfalls. I'm now going to move into questions.
Yeah, thank you. We did end up getting a few.
Okay.
In your consultancy's experience with different sized clients, how have you seen organizations gone about making the decision between deciding E1, I1, or R2?
Great question. It all comes back to who are your customers and what are they requiring, right? If your business partners, your customers, is it a contractual obligation to get HITRUST certified, or is this more of an internal effort? The E1, I think we talked about a lot of the highlights, why it makes sense for a lot of organizations, but face it, it does not provide a very high level of assurance when compared to the I1 or the R2. So it's really a conversation that I like to have with leadership in identifying where the requirement to get HITRUST certification is coming from, and then working from there. And I think, additionally, with the new portfolio having the 3 certification types, sometimes planning that out longer term. So maybe we want to start with E1, move it into I1, and then eventually R2. That comes to play. But it really comes back to think about who the intended readers of your certification report are going to be, and what level of assurance are they going to require. And I think the two of those together is going to point you in the right direction.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I can also share even from my own experience when I'm connecting with C-suite or leaders in GRC. In a lot of cases, they're going and they're asking their sales teams, their leadership of sales, what are you running into out there? And then you can also even look at the questionnaires that have to be completed on behalf of your own vendors and the partners that you work with, and what are they asking for in regards to HITRUST.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's some great call outs there, Justin. Thank you. And then the next question is twofold. What compliance frameworks does HITRUST map well with? And are there efficiencies, cost savings by tackling multiple frameworks in parallel with HITRUST? For example, PCI, SOC, ISO. Any thoughts there, Justin?
Yeah, I'll start with, does it map well? Yes. You have to understand that the HITRUST CSF framework, think of a big Venn diagram. And what HITRUST did is they pulled requirements from ISO 27001, PCI, NIST, say 853, 171, and they just put these all together into this package. And this package is the HITRUST CSF. So it's built on other frameworks. And once you get access and you get access to the MyCSF HITRUST website, there are some different reporting mechanisms that can help map out both your in-scope requirements against other frameworks. When you really dive into it, there's probably 100 different frameworks that have some part in this overall framework. The HITRUST CSF, its structure is over 2,000 requirements. And I think that speaks to how many different frameworks are included. within the framework. And then the second part of that, efficiencies or cost savings when you combine the efforts with other compliance activities, absolutely, yes. So I think from a cost perspective, yes, but I want to talk specifically about resource and the amount of time an organization has to dedicate to achieving HITRUST. So we talked earlier in this conversation about layering a HITRUST E1 on top of, I think I used the example of SOC 2. So here at Tevora, we do this a lot, and it's pretty obvious to me why. It's because of the efficiency. So if we can present to our customers a unified assessment that has all the requirements for, let's say, PCI, SOC 2, HITRUST E1, we can present that as one audit. So all the requirements together, we do all the mapping on the backside. Let's do interviews based on this requirement set. Here's your evidence request for this. So we can present it as one audit. We do the work on the back end on our side, and we're able to output 2, 3, 4 different reports. Kevin, I think there was a recent example where we were able to form a HITRUST R2, PCI, HIPAA security attestation, risk analysis, and SOC 2 at the same time, right? When you think about an organization and these ongoing audit cycles, how much time did we save that organization, right? So they were doing all of this independently. As long as you can get the scope and the timing to align, which really is the hardest part, it's really a no-brainer just because it's so much more efficient doing all this work at the same time.
Oh, fantastic. And then one last question here. With version 11, what changes are we expecting to see, and what will that mean for the differences between E1, I1, or R2?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, version 11, it's been out for a while. We're kind of on a sub-release, 11.03 right now. The biggest difference when you make the jump from version 9 to version 11, there was no version 10. That's probably going to be the next question. Is that the evaluative elements are broken out and more visible. So when you think about the HITRUST E1, that's the focus of today's talk, there's 44 requirements. Even though there's 44 requirements, if you take one out of that and you look at it closely, there's evaluative elements. And essentially what that looks like is there's multiple requirements within one. So there's some controls within the HITRUST E1 that might have 7, 8, 9, 10 evaluative elements, right? So it's provides much more detail, and that detail is much more clear. They pulled essentially to kind of dive into the weeds, they pulled some language out of the policy level illustrated procedures and put that in the requirement statement, so it's very visible on what the requirements are. That was a major change in version 11. But it's going to evolve over time, right? That's the whole point of, I talked about this earlier, HITRUST CSF is threat adaptive. It's designed to change over time. It's designed to evolve. So I think that's very unique, and that's why I really like how HITRUST has positioned version 11 specifically for that.
That's perfect. That's it from a questions perspective. For those that are on with us and for those that are tuning in at a later date listening to the recording, I can speak on behalf of Justin. He is a very approachable, easygoing manager within Tevora, so he's got his email listed on this slide. I would encourage you, if you have any questions, kind of a email or phone a friend type deal, please reach out to Justin. He's happy to help to kind of dissect what you're looking at as far as your particular organization. Yeah, that's I believe it from us, Justin, unless there's anything else you wanted to share in closing.
No, all good. Thanks, Kevin.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. We really appreciate the time. Hope you had a good holiday weekend, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.